Greetings, everybody. It's video 27. We're in week 4 of Liturgy and Sacraments for the Catholic Distance University, and we are talking about the Eucharist. And we're talking about, in this class, in week 4, the essence of the Eucharist. What is it that is tradition with a capital T? It is non-negotiable. It goes back to Christ and the apostles. So we're going to talk about that. And that really is going to take a couple of videos, but the first video here, we're going to talk about something that is essential, something that we can't change. And that is what the later medieval people will say, the medieval theologians, is the matter of the sacrament. There's matter and there's form. So matter is the sacramental sign. And so what is the sacramental sign that goes back to Christ and the apostles that we can't change? And that is bread and wine. And so we need to talk about and unpack bread and wine, because Jesus chose these symbols, and they are symbols. He chose them very deliberately. After the consecration, they become not empty symbolic reminders, they're full symbols. So, but we need to understand them as symbols. Significando causans is a phrase used by Aquinas and the medievals, which means that the causality or the efficacy of the sacraments has a great deal to do with their meaning. So we need to understand their meaning. We need to ponder their meaning. And one of my contentions is that in adoration, one of the great things to do in adoration is to ponder the meaning of the sacramental sign under which the Lord makes himself bodily present. So we shouldn't just forget the meaning. And I do find this is a problem very often, is the meaning is not unpacked and pondered and taught and chewed upon and contemplated. So let's not do that. Let's try to unpack its richness a little bit right now. First of all, I will just say that at the Last Supper, there's a little bit of dispute, okay? Again, historically, is it a Passover meal or the night before Passover? Is it a great friendship meal, a festive friendship meal that Jesus does the night before the Passover is actually celebrated? And the reason I'm just bringing that up is because it has a little bit to do with whether it's barley bread or wheat bread, or whether it's unleavened bread or leavened bread. And I'll just make this clear. The church has never, and I believe probably never will, tell you the Last Supper historically was the night Jews were eating Passover and therefore was a Passover meal. I don't think that's going to happen. And it's interesting in the history of salvation that the East typically uses leavened bread. And the West actually used leavened bread for a long time. And the Armenians seem to be the oldest ones who use unleavened bread. But the point is, it's valid to use leavened or unleavened bread. That is not part of the essence of the sacrament, okay? However, wheat, barley, spelt, wheat has been identified since apostolic times as being essential to the meaning of the sacrament. So anyway, wheat is the most common popular grain, the greatest grain, the most valuable grain in the ancient world. There are other grains that were eaten, like barley early in the spring. And barley loaves actually were loaves that were used at Passover many times, and we see barley mentioned in the multiplication of loaves and fish. But the point is, the church from apostolic times has made a great deal of the symbolism of wheat, so it's deemed essential to the sacrament. So, and also wine. Can any wine be used in the sacrament? And the answer is no. It needs to be grape wine. The Lord chose the fruit of the vine, and therefore its symbolism is very, very important, and we need to unpack that. And it's so important that you can't use Boone's Farm apple wine. If you use that in Mass, it's invalid. Okay, so it's really important to understand the symbols of wine and the grape and of bread. So let's take a look at wheat bread. There's multiple different meanings of every symbol. Just keep that in mind. I'm going to harp on that again and again. A symbol, as part of the essential meaning of what symbol is, it means more than one thing. It's polyvalent. This is part of the power of symbol as opposed to an ordinary sign. And so a symbol in human life, it has great richness. And so we need to unpack the multiple meanings of all the sacraments, as we did with water and chrism. Now we do with bread. Okay, so there's unleavened bread of affliction. And that's part of the background of the story because of the Passover context of the Last Supper. Unleavened bread particularly recalls the first great act of salvation, which is the Passover, the deliverance from Egypt. Okay, but also bread recalls manna. Now, manna wasn't wheat bread, but it was bread from heaven, and it was the daily food of the people as they marched through the desert. They can't grow crops in the desert, so they don't have true wheat bread. So manna is a gift from God that comes from heaven. And it's very important. And one of the interesting things about manna is that Deuteronomy 8:3 says it teaches us something. And it teaches us that not by bread alone does man live, but by every word that comes from the mouth of God. So the Eucharistic bread is manna in the sense that it's bread from heaven, and it's not bread alone. It's really the Word of God that comes to us under the form of bread. Jesus himself is personally the Word. So that's a little bit of the connection with manna. If you go to the Shrine of the Immaculate Conception in Washington, D.C., the Eucharistic Chapel, which is one of the side chapels, has a rather amazing little image of manna that has all these golden pieces of manna that are suspended from the ceiling that are coming down around the tabernacle. It's kind of really cool. So if you ever go there, make sure that you spend a little time in Eucharistic adoration there for a few minutes at least, and take a look at that beautiful depiction of the manna and its connection to the Eucharist. Also, it's fascinating that Melchizedek, who is mentioned in Genesis, and also later mentioned in Hebrews. He's mentioned in one of the Psalms that talks about the king as a priest according to the order of Melchizedek. And Melchizedek was not a Levitical priest, and his sacrifice that he was offering when Abraham met with him in Genesis was bread and wine. And there's no mention of his genealogy, where he comes from. And so he's a very mysterious figure in Jewish thinking at the time of Jesus and in the first century. And so the author of Hebrews really draws out these parallels between Jesus and Melchizedek. But the bread and wine of Melchizedek is recalled by the bread and wine of the Eucharist. There, in the Old Testament, there was a cereal offering. You can see that in Leviticus 2. So there's a cereal offering that's offered to the Lord. There's showbread that is out as an offering to the Lord before the Holy of Holies. That showbread actually goes back before the temple. David and his men, when they were on the lamb and Saul was pursuing them, he goes to a sanctuary and there's a priest there, and he says, "You have anything to eat?" And the priest says, "Well, I have nothing but the sanctified bread, the blessed bread that is in the presence of God." That's the show bread. So anyway, bread is offered to God in the Old Testament through a cereal offering, through the show bread. Also, this is part of the imagery of bread that is very important. It goes back to Paul. We see it in Paul's account of the Eucharist. We see it in the Didache. But bread is made up of various grains of wheat, and they're gathered together to form one loaf. Now, unity is part of the significance and the point, or the res, the fruit of the Eucharist is supposed to be unity. It manifests the unity of the body of Christ and deepens that unity. And you can see Jesus' emphasis on unity in John 17. So much of the Last Supper discourse in John, which all I think ought to be seen as a commentary on the meaning of the Eucharist. I think that it's very, very important to note just how emphatic Jesus is about loving one another and unity. And unity he prays for in his great prayer, but unity is part of the point of this great sacrament. And so it's symbolized by the wheat itself and how the flour is made from many different grains of wheat that are gathered together. So Didache 9:4 says, "As this piece of bread, as this loaf, was scattered over the hills, and then was brought together from the ends of the earth into your kingdom. And that's really what the Eucharist is meant to do for the church, is gather it together, present the church as a living sacrifice to the Father and united. Okay, so anyway, these are just some allusions. Again, this is, bread, symbols draw into themselves so many different things. They allude to past events in the history of salvation. They have so many levels of meaning. So the same thing is true with wine. There's multiple levels of meaning in wine. One thing I'll just point out about wine is precious. And bread, first of all, you got to be settled to have wine. You can't really have and carry around. First of all, you have to grow it, so you have to have vineyards. You have to be established. So that means having a land, which Israel did not have when they were wandering through the desert. So they didn't have wine out there. And so wine, it really connotes stability. It connotes prosperity. It's a sign of being there, being in the promised land. And it's precious. Wine is precious. It's a lot of work. And you can only really do it once in a year. The grapes are picked in the summer, and then they're crushed, and then they're fermented. And the first wine could be drunk in the fall. So the fall Feast of Booths, the harvest feast, is the most joyous feast because there's lots of wine. In fact, it's probably this feast that Hannah and her husband came to in the book of Samuel, beginning of Samuel. Remember, they come to the sanctuary in Shiloh for the feast. And in the Old Testament, the feast, the greatest feast, wasn't the Passover. It was the Feast of Booths in the fall when you had wine. And he actually thought that her mumbling in prayer at the sanctuary meant that she was drunk. She had had too much wine at the festivities. All right, so that kind of fits in very well with the backstory of the Feast of Booths. So wine is precious. It's festive. So it's poured out in sacrifice as a libation in the ancient world, in pagan religions and in the religion of Israel. And you can see libations right in the prescriptions of the law in Exodus, in Numbers, in Leviticus. But wine, think about it as the blood of the grape. The only way you get wine is by crushing the grape. So and by the way, you can't keep grape juice in the ancient world. There's no refrigeration. So Jesus was not drinking grape juice at the Last Supper. It's really important to get this. You can't drink grape juice except when you crush the grapes. The day that you do so, it's going to start fermenting immediately and going bad, or fermenting into wine. So that's just kind of the facts here. But anyway, just even before the fermentation, the wine, the grape juice is a sign of suffering. It's a sign of blood. So the cup of suffering in the Old Testament, wine can connote suffering. And then you add the fermentation to that. And so fermentation, drinking too much wine can make you stagger, can make you intoxicated, can make you unable to stand. So, between the blood of the grape and the staggering of the fermented grape juice, wine becomes a symbol of God's wrath. Drinking the cup of wine can be a cup of suffering and of judgment. And that's all there. Psalm 60, verse 3. You made your people go through hardship. You made us stagger from the wine you gave us. All right. You see in the Last Supper that the cup of suffering is being offered to Christ. And he asks that this cup would pass him by. So you see that dimension to the cup. Yes, wine is precious, but also wine is a symbol of suffering and of judgment. All right? Now, blood is precious because it is life. And so wine as a symbol of blood it's important, again, to keep in mind that you don't drink blood in the Old Testament. You drink wine, yes, but you don't really drink blood because it belongs to God. In fact, if you do drink blood, you are cut off from the people. It's that serious an offense, and that's why you have kosher rabbis who certify proper slaughter of animals. Okay? Now, the other side of joy, remember, wine can only be made when you have land and you're settled. So Israel didn't have its own land. It was slaves in Egypt, and then they were wanderers for 40 years in the desert. So having wine is a sign that you've gotten there. You've arrived in the promised land. You now have vines. Now you have olive trees. You know, the quintessential sign of shalom, of contentment, of prosperity. Shalom does not just mean cessation of hostilities. It's not just peace in that sense. It means fulfillment. It means abundance. So shalom means all those things. Peace, salam, in Aramaic, shalom. It means all these things, including every man under his own vine and under his own fig tree. That is the sign of shalom under Solomon. You can find that in the Old Testament. And for that reason, I have a vine that covers our back patio, a pergola, and we sit under it. And we have a big fig tree. It's the biggest one I've ever seen. So anyway, we have that in my backyard. But these are the signs of shalom and abundance. So wine is a sign of joy. It's a sign of celebration. It's a sign of festivity. It's a sign of the kingdom, of the promised land itself, which is a sign of the future kingdom, the messianic banquet, the age to come. So Judges 9:13 says that wine cheers gods and men. Psalm 104:15 says it gladdens the hearts of men. In Isaiah 25:6, there's a beautiful vision of the last days. On that day, says the Lord, I will set before you on that mountain, the holy mountain, a feast of rich food and choice wines, juicy, rich food and pure, choice wines. So that's a New American Bible translation, which I like a lot. And that really recalls the choice wine of Cana. Cana was a sign of fulfillment of this prophecy. The whole ministry of Jesus was this new time of abundance. And you may not catch this, but Jesus's whole ministry was typified by banquets in which wine was drunk. And wine is not something that is common. It's a Sabbath thing if you're wealthy. It's for the king every day. But for most people, it's maybe only at Passover time and at the great feasts of booths and things like that. So, because it's very expensive. But during the time of Jesus, Jesus is the bridegroom. He doesn't fast like John the Baptist's disciples and the Pharisees. They're not fasting, he and his disciples. And the Pharisees object to this. But it's a time of feasting. It's a time of homecoming. The prodigals are coming home. It's a homecoming feast. So Luke 15, the big feast of the Father in the story that celebrates the return of the Son, well, that was going on for 3 years in Jesus' public ministry. So there's lots of wine and celebration because the prodigals are coming home and the bridegroom is here. So anyway, you just see glimpses of that in the gospel accounts, but if you read more deeply, you understand that this is part of the whole public ministry of Jesus. So anyway, this is phenomenal. And Amos 9:13, beautiful prophecy of the last days. And Amos says, on that day, the juice of the grapes shall drip down the mountains, and all the hills shall run with it. So anyway, all these allusions are part of the meaning of wine, the suffering, the preciousness, the promised land, the future messianic age of abundance. All these things are there. It points forward to the wedding feast of the Lamb in heavenly glory when Jesus returns. It's a foretaste of that now. Okay, so let's just point out this. We're going to talk a little bit more about the essence of the Eucharist in the next video. We're going to talk about the issue of sacrifice, which is part of the essential meaning of the Eucharist. Is the Eucharist a sacrifice, and in what way? Okay, but right now I just want to make this distinction very clearly, that there's the essence and there's the form that the Eucharist takes over time. We actually don't know the exact form of the Last Supper in all of its details. We have very abbreviated accounts of the Last Supper ritual. In John, we have a very long account of what Jesus said, but very little about what he did except the washing of the feet. And we have the institution accounts in Paul and the 3 synoptics, but they're very brief. So anyway, the actual exact form of the Eucharist has changed over time. We'll see this. And the essence always has to be embodied. It has to be enculturated, it has to be embodied, but this form can and has changed over time and will continue to change. And it also has varied from place to place, as we find in the various rites of the church. I just want to point out right now, we've already made the point that it's the magisterium of the church that determines what is the essence of the sacrament. Okay, theologians can weigh in on it. We can all have various opinions on it. But the buck stops somewhere, and it stops with the Pope. And he actually is the one who determines, unless a council weighs in on this with his approval, as Trent did, he will determine what's necessary for, what cannot be changed, tradition with a capital T. Now, tradition with a small t is still under the control of the pastors of the churches. And I say this because the churches, the form varies from rite to rite. The Maronite Church, the Roman Church. The Pope, as successor of Peter, is over the entire church and over the magisterium, or the teaching authority of the church. But also, he is supreme pastor of, in a special way, he's the patriarch of the West. And the Roman rite is the church, is the missal and the ritual of the Church of Rome. And so the Pope also has rights over, with the collaboration with his bishops, of course, over the way in which, the form in which the essence of the Eucharist is celebrated in this particular time, and in the future, as things perhaps are proposed for change, the Pope and the bishops. Now, sometimes the Pope gives bishops of a particular area, like the U.S. Catholic Conference or the Bishops' Conference of various countries. He gives them a certain leeway to decide on certain things having to do with the form and celebration of the sacraments. We've seen this in confirmation. So normally, confirmation should be right at the age of reason, preceding Eucharist. However, the bishops' conferences of various countries can, given their circumstances, pastoral needs of their people, they can decide on a different time for confirmation than the age of reason. Okay, we saw that. So, the norms for celebration of the Eucharist, we'll see this a little bit later, in the United States are slightly different. The rules for kneeling are slightly different because our bishops asked for permission to do it a little differently than it says in the Roman Missal. So anyway, the point I'm making here is it's the Pope, and sometimes it's the bishops of a particular country with the authority of the Pope who make decisions on the form and the celebration of the liturgy. Now, I just want to point out that this is actually embedded, these principles are embedded in magisterial teaching, in Sacrosanctum Concilium, for example. So here's what Sacrosanctum Concilium says. The liturgy is composed of unchangeable, divinely instituted elements. And I would say, it doesn't say this in the text, but I would say this is tradition with a capital T. The distinction between tradition in a capital T and small t was in the mind of the fathers of the Second Vatican Council. Yves Congar was an important peritus at the council. He was the one who proposed that distinction. It actually becomes formally used and accepted in the Catechism of the Catholic Church after the council. But the reality is present in the minds of the fathers and in the teaching, and this is an example of it. So there's something that's unchanging because it goes back to Christ. And I would also say there are some things like wheat bread that go back to the apostles, all right? There's other things that go back to the apostles, like the sign of the cross. So we don't know that Jesus, gave us. I don't think Jesus himself instituted the sign of the cross, but the apostles instituted the sign of the cross most likely. This is what the early fathers tell us. Okay, so tradition with a capital T that can't be changed. And elements subject to change. This would be traditions with a small t. The latter not only may be changed, but ought to be changed with the passage of time. This is a principle clearly enunciated in Sacrosanctum Concilium, approved, of course, by the Holy Father, both to eliminate inappropriate accretions. Now, this shows you something that is not clearly spelt out in Dei Verbum regarding the nature of tradition. If you remember, if you took fundamental theology, I use the analogy there of tradition as a river. And when you use that analogy, all analogies limp, okay? But one of the problems with the analogy of tradition as an acorn that grows into an oak, now that's used by St. Vincent of Lerins. What's beautiful about that analogy, it shows you that later on something can look very different visibly than the way it looked early on. And I would say this is true with an embryo and a baby and an adult human being. Same thing. The problem with these growth analogies, though, is that there's no foreign element that ever can come in. There's no, mutation that takes place, Now, the fact of tradition is, in tradition, if the river analogy shows you, you can pick up some silt. the river of tradition can pick up some flotsam, some driftwood or something that can clog the river even or make it dirty. So there are accretions that can be picked up in the church's life that are just time-bound elements. There are things that are just time-bound expressions of the tradition with a capital T, and they can become inappropriate as times change, or not very clear, or not very helpful as times change. Okay, so that's one issue. But the other issue is there are accretions, or there are things that can be lost that shouldn't have been lost. And there are things that can be added in that are obscuring, or that are not helpful, or maybe never ideally should have been added in. But anyway, the point is the idea of some things getting mixed into the liturgical tradition or the doctrinal tradition that just aren't all that great, that maybe were foreign elements. They weren't necessarily idolatrous or anything like that, but they weren't things that were all that helpful. We can see that now, and you really can't see it when people adopted them from their local culture. Remember, there needs to be a critical assimilation of contemporary culture. You can't keep the church away from all contemporary culture. Then the church wouldn't be relevant. We wouldn't really be people of our age. But on the other hand, you can't let in, or shouldn't let in, things that are contrary to the gospel, or things that are unhelpful or obscure the gospel. So, this is a careful kind of a thing that happens. And in the doctrinal liturgical traditions, sometimes there are things that get let in, or things that become assumed, or things that kind of get in there that aren't so great. It doesn't mean that, again, that there's heresy, but it does mean that there needs to be some purification. The church pastors at a particular point can look back and say, okay, this that we're doing now was okay back then. This maybe, I don't know why it ever got in there, but we just need we need now to allow this to lapse. And we need to remove this from the liturgy. So anyway, here's the point. This is actually put in the council documents. So I think it's an important principle to realize, okay? To eliminate inappropriate accretions, or simply for the sake of aggiornamento. Things sometimes need to be taken out, or things need to be changed, okay? So the point I'm making here is there's a twofold reason for why some things need to be changed in the liturgy over time. And aggiornamento, just keep in mind that simply means updating, or it means something that's understandable and effective pastorally for this time. It doesn't mean acceptable to the values of this time. That's illegitimate aggiornamento. In other words, accommodation to the whims and fancies of the current pagan age is not what aggiornamento legitimately means. It means adaptation so as to be accessible to people of this time, to be understandable, to be fruitful, maximally fruitful to the people of this time. That's the idea of legitimate aggiornamento. And that was the aim of the Second Vatican Council, which we'll talk about more in the next class, in the revision of the sacred liturgy, especially the Eucharistic liturgy, which is the central aspect of life, the central celebration, the summit of the life of the Church.
Sanguinisque preciosi, quem in mundi pretio, fructus ventris generosi, rex effudit gentium. Nobis datus, nobis natus, et intacta Virgine, et in mundo conversatus falso verbis semine, sui moras incollatus miro clausit ordine. Recumbens cum fratribus, observata lege plene, cidis in legalibus, cibum turbe duodenes sedat suis manibus. Catholicum documentum novo cedat ritui. Restet fides supplementum sensum defectui. Genitori, genitorque laus et jubilatio, salus